Meantime, the condition of things in the painter's household continued much the same for Wolkenlicht. Work all day, no communication between the young people, the dinner and the wine, silent reading when work was done, with stolen glances many over the top of the book, glances that were never returned, the cold good night, the locking of the door, the wakeful night and the drowsy morning. But at length a change came, and sooner than any of the party had expected, for whether it was that the impatience of Teufelsbürst had urged him to yet more dangerous experiments, or that the continuance of those he had been so long employing had overcome at length the vitality of Wolkenlicht, one afternoon as he was sitting at his work he suddenly dropped from his chair, and his master, hurrying to him in some alarm, found him rigid and apparently lifeless. Lilith was not in the study when this took place. In justice to Teufelsbürst, it must be confessed that he employed all the skill he was master of, which for beneficent purposes was not very great, to restore the youth, but without avail. At last, hearing the footsteps of Lilith, he desisted in some consternation, and that she might escape being shocked by the sight of a dead body where she had been accustomed to see a living one, he removed the lay figure from the couch, and laid Karl in its place, covering him with a black velvet pall. He was just in time. She started at seeing no one in Karl's place and said, "Where is your pupil, father?" "Gone home," he answered with a kind of convulsive grin. She glanced round the room, caught sight of the lay figure where it had not been before, looked at the couch and saw the pall yet heaved up from beneath, opened her eyes till the entire white sweep around the iris suggested a new expression of consternation to Teufelsbürst, though from a quarter whence he did not desire or look for it, and then without a word sat down to a drawing she had been busy upon the day before. But her father, glancing at her now as Wolkenlicht had used to do, could not help seeing that she was frightfully pale. She showed no other sign of uneasiness. As soon as he released her, she withdrew, with one more glance as she passed at the couch and the figure blocked out in black upon it. She hastened to her chamber, shut and locked the door, sat down on the side of the couch, and fell, not a-weeping, but a-thinking. Was he dead? What did it matter? They would all be dead soon. Her mother was dead already. It was only that the earth could not bear more children, except she devoured those to whom she had already given birth. But what if they had to come back in another form, and live another sad, hopeless, loveless life over again? And so she went on questioning, and receiving no replies, while through all her thoughts passed and repassed the eyes of Wolkenlicht, which she had so often felt to be upon her, when she did not see them. Wild with repressed longing, the light of their love shining through the veil of diffused tears, ever gathering and never overflowing. Then came the pale face, so worshipping, so distant in its self-withdrawn devotion, slowly dawning out of the vapors of her reverie. When it vanished, she tried to see it again. It would not come when she called it, but when her thoughts left knocking at the door of the lost and wandered away, out came the pale, troubled, silent face again, gathering itself up from some unknown nook in her world of fantasy. And once more, when she tried to steady it by the fixedness of her own regard, fading back into the mist. So the phantasm of the dead drew near and wooed as the living had never dared. What if there were any good in loving? What if men and women did not die all out, but some dim shade of each, like that pale mind-ghost of Wolkenlicht, floated through the eternal vapors of chaos? And what if they might sometimes cross each other's path? Meet. Know that they met. Love on. Would not that revive the withered memory, fix the fleeting ghost, give a new habitation, a body even, to the poor unhoused wanderers frozen by the eternal frosts, no longer thinking beings, but thoughts wandering through the brain of the melancholy mass. Back with the thought came the face of the dead Karl, and the maiden threw herself on her bed in a flood of bitter tears. She could have loved him, if he had only lived. She did love him, for he was dead. But even in the midst of the remorse that followed, for had she not killed him? Life seemed a less hard and hopeless thing than before, for it is love itself, and not its responses or results, that is the soul of life and its pleasures. 2 hours passed ere she could again show herself to her father, from whom she seemed in some new way divided by the new feeling in which he did not and could not share. But at last, lest he should seek her, and finding her should suspect her thoughts, she descended and sought him. For there is a maidenliness in sorrow that wraps her garments close around her. But he was not to be seen. The door of the study was locked. A shudder passed through her as she thought of what her father, who lost no opportunity in furthering his all but perfect acquaintance with the human form and structure, might be about with the figure which she knew lay dead beneath that velvet pall, but which had arisen to haunt the hollow caves and cells of her living brain. She rushed away and up once more to her silent room, through the darkness which had now settled down in the house, threw herself again on her bed, and lay almost paralyzed with horror and distress. But Teufelsbürst was not about anything so frightful as she supposed, though something frightful enough. I have already implied that Wolkenlicht was, in form, as fine an embodiment of youthful manhood as any old Greek republic could have provided one of its sculptors with, as a model for an Apollo. It is true that to the eye of a Greek artist he would not have been more acceptable in consequence of the regimen he had been going through for the last few weeks, but the emaciation of Wolkenlicht's frame, and the consequent prominence of the muscles indicating the pain he had gone through, were peculiarly attractive to Teufelsbürst. He was busy preparing to take a cast of the body of his dead pupil, that it might aid to the perfection of his future labors. He was deep in the artistic enjoyment of a form, at the same time so beautiful and strong, yet with the lines of suffering in every limb and feature, when his daughter's hand was laid on the latch. He started, flung the velvet drapery over the body, and went to the door. But Lilith had vanished. He returned to his labors. The operation took a long time, for he performed it very carefully. Towards midnight he had finished encasing the body in a close clinging shell of plaster, which when broken off and fitted together would be the matrix to the form of the dead Wolkenlicht. Before leaving it to harden till the morning, he was just proceeding to strengthen it with an additional layer all over, when a flash of lightning, reflected in all its dazzle from the snow without, almost blinded him. A peal of long-drawn thunder followed. The wind rose, and just such a storm came on as had risen some time before at the death of Kunz, whose spectre was still tormenting the city. The gnomes of terror, deep hidden in the caverns of Teufelsbürst's nature, broke out jubilant. With trembling hands he tried to cast the pall over the awful white chrysalis, failed, and fled to his chamber, and there lay the studio naked to the eyes of the lightning, with its tortured forms throbbing out of the dark and quivering as with life in the almost continuous palpitations of the light. While on the couch lay the motionless mass of whiteness, gleaming blue in the lightning, almost more terrible in its crude indications of the human form than that which it enclosed. It lay there as if dropped from some tree of chaos, haggard with the snows of eternity, a huge misshapen nut with a corpse for its kernel. But the lightning would soon have revealed a more terrible sight still, had there been any eyes to behold it. At midnight, while a peal of thunder was just dying away in the distance, the crust of death flew asunder, rending in all directions, and Pale as his investiture, staring with ghastly eyes, the form of Karl started up, sitting on the couch. Had he not been far beyond ordinary men in strength, he could not thus have rent his sepulchre. Indeed, had Teufelsbürst been able to finish his task by the additional layer of gypsum which he had contemplated, he must have died the moment life revived, although so long as the trance lasted, neither the exclusion from the air nor the practical solidification of the walls of his chest could do him any injury. He had laid unconscious throughout the operations of Teufelsbürst, but now the catalepsy had passed away, possibly under the influence of the electric condition of the atmosphere. Very likely the strength he now put forth was intensified by a convulsive reaction of all the powers of life, as is not infrequently the case in sudden awakenings from similar interruptions of vital activity. The coming to himself and the bursting of his case were simultaneous. He sat staring about him, with, of all his mental faculties, only his imagination awake, from which the thoughts that occupied it when he fell senseless had not yet faded. These thoughts had been compounded of feelings about Lilith, and speculations about the vampire that haunted the neighborhood, and the fumes of the last drug of which he had partaken, still hovering in his brain, combined with these thoughts and fancies to generate the delusion that he had just broken from the embrace of his coffin and risen, the last born of the vampire race. The sense of unavoidable obligation to fulfill his doom was yet mingled with a faint flutter of joy, for he knew that he must go to Lilith. With a deep sigh, he rose, gathered up the pall of black velvet, flung it around him, stepped from the couch, and left the study to find her. Meantime, Teufelsbürst had sufficiently recovered to remember that he had left the door of the studio unfastened and that anyone entering would discover in what he had been engaged, which in the case of his getting into any difficulty about the death of Karl would tell powerfully against him. He was at the farther end of a long passage leading from the house to the studio on his way to make all secure when Karl appeared at the door and advanced towards him. The painter, seized with invincible terror, turned and fled. He reached his room and fell senseless on the floor. The phantom held on its way, heedless. Lilith, on gaining her room the second time, had thrown herself on her bed as before and had wept herself into a troubled slumber. She lay dreaming, and dreadful dreams. Suddenly she awoke in one of those peals of thunder which tormented the high regions of the air as a storm billows the surface of the ocean. She lay awake and listened. As it died away, she thought she heard, mingling with its last muffled murmurs, the sound of moaning. She turned her face towards the room in keen terror, but she saw nothing. Another light, long-drawn sigh reached her ear, and at the same moment a flash of lightning illumined the room. In the corner farthest from the bed she spied a white face, nothing more. She was dumb and motionless with fear. Utter darkness followed, a darkness that seemed to enter into her very brain. Yet she felt that the face was slowly crossing the black gulf of the room and drawing near to where she lay. The next flash revealed, as it bended over her, the ghastly face of Karl, down which flowed fresh tears. The rest of his form was lost in blackness. Lilith did not faint, but it was the very force of her fear that seemed to keep her alive. It became for the moment the atmosphere of her life. She lay trembling and staring at the spot in the darkness where she supposed the face of Karl still to be, but the next flash showed her the face far off, looking at her through the panes of her lattice window. For Lochen, as soon as he saw Lilith, seemed to himself to go through a second stage of awakening. Her face made him doubt whether he could be a vampire after all, for instead of wanting to bite her arm and suck the blood, he all but fell down at her feet in a passion of speechless love. The next moment he became aware that his presence must be at least very undesirable to her, and in an instant he had reached her window, which he knew looked upon a lower roof that extended between the two different parts of the house, and before the next flash came he had stepped through the lattice and closed it behind him. Believing his own room to be attainable from this quarter, he proceeded along the roof in the direction he judged best. The cold winter air by degrees restored him entirely to his right mind, and he soon comprehended the whole of the circumstances in which he found himself. Peeping through a window he was passing to see whether it belonged to his room, he spied Teufelsbürst, who at the very moment was lifting his head from the faint into which he had fallen at the first sight of Lottchen. The moon was shining clear, and in its light the painter saw, to his horror, the pale face staring in at his window. He thought it had been there ever since he had fainted, and dropped again in a deeper swoon than before. Karl saw him fall, and the truth flashed upon him that the wicked artist took him for what he had believed himself to be, when first he recovered from his trance, namely, the vampire of the former Karl Wolkenlicht. The moment he comprehended it, he resolved to keep up the delusion if possible. Meanwhile, he was innocently preparing a new ingredient for the popular dish of horrors to be served at the ordinary of the city the next day. For the old servants were not the only eyes that had seen him besides those of Teufelsbürst. What could be more like a vampire dragging his pall after him than this apparition of poor, half-frozen Lottchen crawling across the roof? Karl remembered afterwards that he had heard the dogs howling awfully in every direction as he crept along, but this was hardly necessary to make those who saw him conclude that it was the same phantasm of John Kuntz which had been infesting the whole city, and especially the house next door to the painter's, which had been the dwelling of the respectable alderman, who had degenerated into this most disreputable of moneyless vagabonds. What added to the consternation of all who heard of it was the sickening conviction that the extreme measures which they had resorted to in order to free the city from the ghoul, beyond which nothing could be done, had been utterly unavailing, successful as they had proved in every other known case of the kind. For, urged as well by various horrid signs about his grave, which not even its close proximity to the altar could render a place of repose, they had opened it and found in the body every peculiarity belonging to a vampire, had pulled it out with the greatest difficulty on account of a quite supernatural ponderosity, which rendered the horse which had killed him, a strong animal, all but unable to drag it along, and had at last, after cutting it in pieces and expending on the fire 216 great billets, succeeded in conquering its incombustibleness and reducing it to ashes. Such at least was the story which had reached the painter's household, and was believed by many. And if all this did not compel the perturbed corpse to rest, what more could be done? When Karl had reached his room and was dressing himself, the thought struck him that something might be made of the report of the extreme weight of the body of old Kuntz to favor the continuance of the delusion of Teufelsbürst, although he hardly knew yet to what use he could turn this delusion. He was convinced that he would have made no progress however long he might have remained in this house, and that he would have more chance of favor with Lilith if he were to meet her in any other circumstances whatever than those in which he invariably saw her, namely, surrounded by her father's influences and watched by her father's cold blue eyes. As soon as he was dressed, he crept down to the studio, which was now quiet enough, the storm being over and the moon filling it with her steady shine. In the corner lay in all directions the fragments of the mold which his own body had formed and filled. The bag of plaster and the bucket of water which the painter had been using stood beside. Lottchen gathered all the pieces together, and then making his way to an outhouse where he had seen various odds and ends of rubbish lying, chose from the heap as many pieces of old iron and other metal as he could find. To these he added a few large stones from the garden. When he had got all into the studio, he locked the door and proceeded to fit together the parts of the mold, filling up the hollow as he went with the heaviest things he could get into it, and solidifying the whole by pouring in plaster, till, having at length completed it and obliterated as much as possible the marks of joining, he left it to harden with the conviction that now it would make a considerable impression on Teufelsbürst's imagination, as well as on his muscular sense. He then left everything else as nearly undisturbed as he could, and knowing all the ways of the house, was soon in the street without leaving any signs of his exit. Karl soon found himself before the house in which his friend Hohenlocken resided. Knowing his studious habits, he had hoped to see his light still burning, nor was he disappointed. He contrived to bring him to his window, and a moment after the door was cautiously opened. "Why, Lottchen, where do you come from?" "From the grave, Heinrich, or next door to it." "Come in and tell me all about it. We thought the old painter had made a model of you and tortured you to death." "Perhaps you are not far wrong. But get me a horn of ale, for even a vampire is thirsty, you know." "A vampire!" exclaimed Heinrich, retreating a pace and involuntarily putting himself upon his guard. Karl laughed. "My hand was warm, was it not, old fellow?" he said. "Vampires are cold. All but the blood." "What a fool I am," rejoined Heinrich. "But you know we have been hearing such horrors lately that our fellow may be excused for shuddering a little, when a pale-faced apparition tells him at 2 o'clock in the morning that he is a vampire, and thirsty too." Karl told him the whole story, and the mental process of regarding it for the sake of telling it revealed to him pretty clearly some of the treatment of which he had been unconscious at the time. Heinrich was quite sure that his suspicions were correct, and now the question was, what was to be done next? "At all events," said Heinrich, "we must keep you out of the way for some time. I will represent to my landlady that you are in hiding from enemies, and her heart will rule her tongue. She can let you have a garret room, I know, and I will do as well as I can to bear you company. We shall have time then to invent some plan of operation." To this proposal Karl agreed with hearty thanks, and soon all was arranged. The only conclusion they could yet arrive at was that somehow or other the old demon painter must be tamed. Meantime, how fared it with Lilith? She too had no doubt that she had seen the body ghost of poor Karl, and that the vampire had, according to rule, paid her the first visit because he loved her best. This was horrible enough if the vampire were not really the person he represented, but if in any sense it were Karl himself, at least it gave some expectation of a more prolonged existence than her father had taught her to look for. And if love anything like her mother's still lasted, even along with the habits of a vampire, there was something to hope for in the future. And then, though he had visited her, he had not, as far as she was aware, deprived her of a drop of blood. She could not be certain that he had not bitten her, for she had been in such a strange condition of mind that she might not have felt it. But she believed that he had restrained the impulses of his vampire nature, and had left her, lest he should yet yield to them. She fell fast asleep, and when morning came, there was not, as far as she could judge, one of those triangular leech-like perforations to be found upon her whole body. Will it be believed that the moment she was satisfied of this, she was seized by a terrible jealousy, lest Karl should have gone and bitten someone else? Most people will wonder that she should not have gone out of her senses at once. But there was all the difference between a visit from a real vampire and a visit from a man she had begun to love, even although she took him for a vampire. All the difference does not lie in a name. They were very different causes, and the effects must be very different. When Teufelsbürst came down in the morning, he crept into the studio like a murderer. There lay the awful white block, seeming to his eyes just the same as he had left it. What was to be done with it? He dared not open it. Mold and model must go together. But whither? If inquiry should be made after Wolkenlicht and this were discovered anywhere on his premises, would it not be enough to bring him at once to the gallows? Therefore it would be dangerous to bury it in the garden, or in the cellar. Besides, thought he with a shudder, that would be to fix the vampire as a guest forever. And the horrors of the past night rushed back upon his imagination with renewed intensity. What would it be to have the dead Karl crawling about his house forever? Now inside, now out, now sitting on the stairs, now staring in at the windows. He would have dragged it to the bottom of his garden, past which the Moldau flowed, and plunged it into the stream. But then, should the spectre continue to prove troublesome, it would be almost impossible to reach the body so as to destroy it by fire. Besides which, he could not do it without assistance and the probability of discovery. If, however, the apparition should turn out to be no vampire, but only a respectable ghost, they might manage to endure its presence, till it should be weary of haunting them. He resolved at last to convey the body for the meantime into a concealed cellar in the house, seeing something must be done before his daughter came down. Proceeding to remove it, his consternation was greatly increased when he discovered how the body had grown in weight since he had thus disposed of it, leaving on his mind scarcely a hope that it could turn out not to be a vampire after all. He could scarcely stir it, and there was but one whom he could call to his assistance, the old woman who had acted as his housekeeper and servant. He went to her room, roused her, and told her the whole story. Devoted to her master for many years and not quite so sensitive to fearful influences as when less experienced in horrors, she showed immediate readiness to render him assistance. Utterly unable, however, to lift the mass between them, they could only drag and push it along, and such a slow toil was it that there was no time to remove the traces of its track before Lilith came down and saw a broad white line leading from the door of the studio down the cellar stairs. She knew in a moment what it meant, but not a word was uttered about the matter, and the name of Karl Wolkenlicht seemed to be entirely forgotten. But how could the affairs of a house go on all the same when every one of the household knew that a dead body lay in the cellar? Nay, more than that. Although it lay still and dead enough all day, it would come half alive at nightfall, and turning the whole house into a sepulchre by its presence, go creeping about like a cat all over it in the dark, perhaps with phosphorescent eyes. So it was not surprising that the painter abandoned his studio earlier, and that the three found themselves together in the gorgeous room formerly described as soon as twilight began to fall. Already Teufelsbürst had begun to experience a kind of shrinking from the horrid faces in his own pictures, and to feel disgusted at the abortions of his own mind. But all that he and the old woman now felt was an increasing fear as the night drew on, a kind of sickening and paralyzing terror. The thing down there would not lie quiet. At least its phantom in the cellars of their imagination would not. As much as possible, however, they avoided alarming Lilith, who, knowing all they knew, was as silent as they. But her mind was in a strange state of excitement, partly from the presence of a new sense of love, the pleasure of which all the atmosphere of grief into which it grew could not totally quench. It comforted her somehow, as a child may comfort when his father is away. Bedtime came, and no one made a move to go. Without a word spoken on the subject, the three remained together all night, the elders nodding and slumbering occasionally, and Lilith getting some share of repose on a couch. All night the shape of death might be somewhere about the house, but it did not disturb them. They heard no sound, saw no sight, and when the morning dawned, they separated, chilled and stupid, and for the time beyond fear, to seek repose in their private chambers. There they remained, equally undisturbed. But when the painter approached his easel a few hours after, looking more pale and haggard still than he was wont from the fears of the night, a new bewilderment took possession of him. He had been busy with a fresh embodiment of his favorite subject into which he had sketched the form of the student as the sufferer. He had represented poor Wolkenlicht as just beginning to recover from a trance while a group of surgeons, unaware of the signs of returning life, were absorbed in a minute dissection of one of the limbs. At an open door he had painted Lilith passing, with her face buried in a bunch of sweet peas. But when he came to the picture, he found to his astonishment and terror that the face of one of the group was now turned towards that of the victim, regarding his revival with demoniac satisfaction and taking pains to prevent the others from discovering it. The face of this prince of torturers was that of Teufelsbürst himself. Lilith had altogether vanished, and in her place stood the dim vampire reiteration of the body that lay extended on the table, staring greedily at the assembled company. With trembling hands, the painter removed the picture from the easel and turned its face to the wall. Of course, this was the work of Lottchen. When he left the house, he took with him the key of a small private door which was so seldom used that, while it remained closed, the key would not be missed, perhaps for many months. Watching the windows, he had chosen a safe time to enter, and had been hard at work all night on these alterations. Teufelsbürst attributed them to the vampire, and left the picture as he found it, not daring to put brush to it again. The next night was passed much after the same fashion. But the fear had begun to die away a little in the hearts of the women, who did not know what had taken place in the studio on the previous night. It burrowed, however, with gathered force in the vitals of Teufelsbürst. But this night likewise passed in peace, and before it was over, the old woman had taken to speculating in her own mind as to the best way of disposing of the body, seeing it was not at all likely to be troublesome. But when the painter entered his studio in trepidation the next morning, he found that the form of the lovely Lilith was painted out of every picture in the room. This could not be concealed, and Lilith and the servant became aware that the studio was the portion of the house in haunting which the vampire left the rest in peace. Karl recounted all the tricks he had played to his friend Heinrich, who begged to be allowed to bear him company the following night. To this Karl consented, thinking it would be considerably more agreeable to have a companion. So they took a couple of bottles of wine and some provisions with them, and before midnight found themselves snug in the studio. They sat very quiet for some time, for they knew that if they were seen, 2 vampires would not be so terrible as one, and might occasion discovery. But at length Heinrich could bear it no longer. "I say, Lottchen, let's go and look for your dead body. What has the old beggar done with it? I think I know." "Stop, let me peep out." "All right, come along." With a lamp in his hand, he led the way to the cellars, and after searching about a little, they discovered it. "It looks hard enough," said Heinrich, "but I think a drop or 2 of wine would brighten it up a little." So he took a bottle from his pocket, and after they had had a glass apiece, he dropped a third in blots all over the plaster. Being red wine, it had the effect Hohenlocken desired. "When they visit it next, they will know that the vampire can find the food he prefers," said he. In a corner close by the plaster, they found the clothes Karl had worn. "Hello," said Heinrich. "We'll make something of this find." So he carried them with him to the studio. There he got hold of the lay figure. "What are you about, Heinrich?" "Going to make a scarecrow to keep the ravens off old Teufel's pictures," answered Heinrich, as he went on dressing the lay figure in Karl's clothes. He next seated the creature at an easel with its back to the door, so that it should be the first thing the painter should see when he entered. Karl meant to remove this before he went, for it was too comical to fall in with the rest of his proceedings. But the 2 sat down to their supper, and by the time they had finished the wine, they thought they should like to go to bed. So they got up and went home, and Carl forgot the lay figure, leaving it in, busy motionless all night before the easel. When Teufelsbürst saw it, he turned and fled with a cry that brought his daughter to his help. He rushed past her, able only to articulate, "The vampire! The vampire! Painting!" Far more courageous than he, because her conscience was more peaceful, Lilith passed on to the studio. She too recoiled a step or two when she saw the figure. But with the sight of the back of Carl, as she supposed it to be, came the longing to see the face that was on the other side. So she crept round and round by the wall as far off as she could. The figure remained motionless. It was a strange kind of shock that she experienced when she saw the face, disgusting from its inanity. The absurdity next struck her, and with the absurdity flashed into her mind the conviction that this was not the doing of a vampire. For of all creatures under the moon, he could not be expected to be a humorist. A wild hope sprang up in her mind that Carl was not dead. Of this she soon resolved to make herself sure. She closed the door of the studio. In the strength of her new hope, undressed the figure, put it in its place, concealing the garments, all the work of a few minutes, and then, finding her father just recovering from the worst of his fear, told him that there was nothing in the studio but what ought to be there, and persuaded him to go and see. He not only saw no one, but found that no further liberties had been taken with his pictures. Reassured, he soon persuaded himself that the spectre in this case had been the offspring of his own terror-haunted brain. But he had no spirit for painting now. He wandered about the house, himself haunting it like a restless ghost. When night came, Lilith retired to her own room. The waters of fear had begun to subside in the house, but the painter and his old attendant did not yet follow her example. As soon, however, as the house was quite still, Lilith glided noiselessly down the stairs, went into the studio, where as yet there assuredly was no vampire, and concealed herself in a corner. As it would not do for an earnest student like Heinrich to be away from his work very often, he had not asked to accompany Lötchen this time, and indeed Carl himself, a little anxious about the result of the scarecrow, greatly preferred going alone. While she was waiting for what might happen, the conviction grew upon Lilith, as she reviewed all the past of the story, that these phenomena were the work of the real Carl and of no vampire. In a few moments, she was still more sure of this. Behind the screen where she had taken refuge hung one of the pictures out of which her portrait had been painted the night before last. She had taken a lamp with her into the studio with the intention of extinguishing it the moment she heard any sign of approach, but as the vampire lingered, she began to occupy herself with examining the picture beside her. She had not looked at it long before she wetted the tip of her forefinger and began to rub away at the obliteration. Her suspicions were instantly confirmed. The substance employed was only a gummy wash over the paint. The delight she experienced at the discovery threw her into a mischievous humor. "I will see," she said to herself, "whether I cannot match Karl Wolkenlicht at this game." In a closet in the room hung a number of costumes, which Lilith had at different times worn for her father. Among them was a large white drapery which she easily disposed as a shroud. With the help of some chalk, she soon made herself ghastly enough, and then placing her lamp on the floor behind the screen and setting a chair over it so that it should throw no light in any direction, she waited once more for the vampire. Nor had she much longer to wait. She soon heard a door move, the sound of which she hardly knew, and then the studio door opened. Her heart beat dreadfully, not with fear lest it should be a vampire after all, but with hope that it was Carl. To see him once more was too great joy. Would she not make up to him for all her coldness? But would he care for her now? Perhaps he had been quite cured of his longing for a hard heart like hers. She peeped. It was he, sure enough, looking as handsome as ever. He was holding his light to look at her last work, and the expression of his face, even in regarding her handiwork, was enough to let her know that he loved her still. If she had not seen this, she dared not have shown herself from her hiding place. Taking the lamp in her hand, she got upon the chair and looked over the screen, letting the light shine from below upon her face. She then made a slight noise to attract Carl's attention. He looked up, evidently rather startled, and saw the face of Lilith in the air. He gave a stifled cry, threw himself on his knees with his arms stretched toward her, and moaned, "I have killed her! I have killed her!" Lilith descended and approached him noiselessly. He did not move. She came close to him and said, "Are you Karl Wolkenlicht?" His lips moved, but no sound came. "If you are a vampire, and I am a ghost," she said, but a low, happy laugh alone concluded the sentence. Karl sprang to his feet. Lilith's laugh changed into a burst of sobbing and weeping, and in another moment the ghost was in the arms of the vampire. Lilith had no idea how far her father had wronged Karl, and though, from thinking over the past, he had no doubt that the painter had drugged him, he did not wish to pain her by imparting this conviction. But Lilith was afraid of a reaction of rage and hatred in her father after the terror was removed, and Karl saw that he might thus be deprived of all further intercourse with Lilith, and all chance of softening the old man's heart towards him. Well, Lilith would not hear of forsaking him who had banished all the human race but herself. They managed at last to agree upon a plan of operation. The first thing they did was to go to the cellar where the plaster mass lay, Karl carrying with him a great axe used for cleaving wood. Lilith shuddered when she saw it, stained as it was with the wine Heinrich had spilt over it, and almost believed herself the midnight companion of a vampire after all, visiting with him the terrible corpse in which he lived all day. But Karl soon reassured her, and a few good blows of the axe revealed a very different core to that which Teufelsbürst supposed to be in it. Karl broke it into pieces, and with Lilith's help, who insisted on carrying her share, the whole was soon at the bottom of the Moldau, and every trace of its ever having existed removed. Before morning, too, the form of Lilith had dawned anew in every picture. There was no time to restore to its former condition the one which Karl had first altered, for in it the changes were all that they seemed, nor indeed was he capable of restoring it in the master's style. But they put it quite out of the way and hoped that sufficient time might elapse before the painter thought of it again. When they had done, and Lilith, for all his entreaties, would remain with him no longer, Karl took his former clothes with him, and having spent the rest of the night in his old room, dressed in them in the morning. When Teufelsbürst entered his studio next day, there sat Karl as if nothing had happened, finishing the drawing on which he had been at work when the fit of insensibility came upon him. The painter started, stared, rubbed his eyes, thought it was another spectral illusion, and was on the point of yielding to his terror when Karl rose and approached him with a smile. The healthy, sunshiny countenance of Karl, let him be ghost or goblin, could not fail to produce somewhat of a tranquilizing effect on Teufelsbürst. He took his offered hand mechanically, his countenance utterly vacant with idiotic bewilderment. Karl said, "I was not well and thought it better to pay a visit to a friend for a few days. But I shall soon make up for lost time, for I am all right now." He sat down at once, taking no notice of his master's behavior, and went on with his drawing. Teufelsbürst stood staring at him for some minutes without moving, then suddenly turned and left the room. Karl heard him hurrying down the cellar stairs. In a few moments he came up again. Karl stole a glance at him. There he stood in the same spot, no doubt more full of bewilderment than ever, but it was not possible that his face should express more. At last he went to his easel, and sat down with a long-drawn sigh as if of relief. But though he sat at his easel, he painted none that day, and as often as Carl ventured a glance, he saw him still staring at him. The discovery that his pictures were restored to their former condition aided, no doubt, in leading him to the same conclusion as the other facts, whatever that conclusion might be. Probably that he had been the sport of some evil power and had been for the greater part of a week utterly bewitched. Lilith had taken care to instruct the old woman, with whom she was all-powerful, and as neither of them showed the smallest traces of the astonishment which seemed to be slowly vitrifying his own brain, he was at last perfectly satisfied that things had been going all right everywhere, but in his inner man. And in this conclusion he certainly was not far wrong in more senses than one. But when all was restored again to the old routine, it became evident that the peculiar direction of his art in which he had hitherto indulged had ceased to interest him. The shock had acted chiefly upon that part of his mental being which had been so absorbed. He would sit for hours without doing anything, apparently plunged in meditation. Several weeks elapsed without any change, and both Lilith and Carl were getting dreadfully anxious about him. Carl paid him every attention, and the old man, for he now looked much older than before, submitted to receive his services, as well as those of Lilith. At length one morning he said in a slow, thoughtful tone, "Carl Wolkenlicht, I should like to paint you." "Certainly, sir," answered Carl, jumping up. "Where would you like me to sit?" So the ice of silence and inactivity was broken, and the painter drew and painted. And the spring of his art flowed once more, and he made a beautiful portrait of Carl, a portrait without evil or suffering. And as soon as he had finished Carl, he began once more to paint Lilith, and when he had painted her, he composed a picture for the very purpose of introducing them together. And in this picture there was neither ugliness nor torture, but human feeling and human hope instead. Then Carl knew that he might speak to him of Lilith, and he spoke, and was heard with a smile. But he did not dare to tell him the truth of the vampire story, till one day that Teufelsbürst was lying on the floor of a room in Carl's ancestral castle, half smothered in grandchildren, when the only answer it drew from the old man was a kind of shuddering laugh and the words, "Don't speak of it, Carl, my boy."
The end of The Cruel Painter by George MacDonald. Stay with me for more stories. I'll see you next time.